Hello. We're back.
Welcome back, everyone. And we'll now start to look at an authentic assessment task and analyze it, first of all, in terms of autonomy. And then perhaps the second time round, we might go through and look at semantics and then specialization.
Yeah, and I think, we had initially planned to do this, as we said earlier, in breakout rooms. What could be useful here, in the spirit of it being a workshop, I think as we start with autonomy, we might find ourselves dipping across into semantics and specialization. And I think just to set maybe some expectations at the beginning, what we're not aiming to do, I think, is a super fine-grained analysis and to come out, to be proceeding towards a super accurate translation device or anything like that. What we're aiming to develop at this point is that kind of like tactile feeling for what the dimensions might, how they might be realized in this particular example.
And it's useful to tease them apart because, whenever we look at authentic assessment discussions, there's a tendency to just simply conflate all of them together, right? So for example, it is widely assumed that if you can set up a task in an authentic context, then the task will be automatically authentic. Or there's an assumption that testing knowledge is something that you do in a classroom, and you should specifically bring students into an authentic context in order to to develop the knower code side of things, or there is an assumption, for example, that when you're in a classroom, everything is left as an abstract conception, and it's only in the authentic workplace that you can actually ground these things in specific circumstances and in specific details, which of course, if you start to explore this in terms of autonomy, semantics, and specialization, you realize that they are not necessarily conflated at all. It's possible to adjust all of these parameters sort of independently to some extent. Of course, it might apply differently from case to case, but as I mentioned before you even get there to talk about how these things combine meaningfully in specific kinds of disciplines or objectives of your discipline, it's useful to be able to tease them apart as separate dimensions first, and then look at how they combine. We have a comment.
Maybe I'll monitor the chat while we're having this discussion, so that we don't need to be doing that on the main screen.
So I hope you have had a little bit of time to look at either one or both of the tasks that we have posted earlier. We will still be going through it during the session nonetheless in more careful detail, but I hope you get a general feel of what people mean by authentic assessment. And I say that these documents are fairly good in terms of covering different aspects of what is expected of the student during the task. In one of our roundtables that we have presented a little bit earlier last year, we have touched on autonomy. So just to recap where we were going with the notion of autonomy as it's applied to authentic assessment. First of all, we acknowledge that when you are doing an autonomy analysis, there is any number of possible targets that you could designate to the analysis, and depending on the target that you select, you're going to get very different results. But here, again, in the spirit of LCT 3.5, we want to be sort of problem-oriented, right? So the first step that we took here, just to make this achievable within the hour, is we have predefined the target, if you will. And as I've mentioned earlier, we are not seeking to pronounce what authentic assessment should be, but rather to start with the idea of what do people mean by authentic in the first place. So a lot of the authentic assessment people, when they start by looking at these assessments and trying to evaluate it in terms of its authenticity, start with a position that an ideal assessment should be as close to the workplace as possible. That's usually what they have as an ideal. And let's just take that tentatively as the target, as our starting point of analysis. Okay, so in that sense, we are designating PA plus and RA plus as the sovereign. So what do we mean by that? I'm not sure if there's anyone here who is new to autonomy. I'm not sure if anybody would like to let us know if you're new to autonomy. So we will cover that introduce that in a little bit more detail.
But I think that's a good preface for this conversation is if anybody at any stage isn't sure what we mean by a particular concept or something like that, I think we'll be flying pretty loose here, just in the spirit of keeping the conversation going, but please just pipe up and we'll certainly be very happy to take the time to look at individual aspects in detail.
Yeah, please feel free to stop us at any time during the workshop if you want to clarify any concepts. So if we look at autonomy in terms of its two components or two parts of it, we have the insulation between constituents. So this is drawing on Carl's definition, right? So first we are thinking about the assessment in terms of its constituents and the degree of insulation. One way of interpreting this, of course, there are a few possible ways of interpreting this once again, but one way of interpreting this in relation to authentic assessment, taking on the considerations of the people who are promoting authentic assessment, we can interpret these constituents in terms of content, right? So to what extent are we talking about content from the classroom or as content as part of tertiary education? And to what extent are we talking about content in terms of the workplace or the site of employment? And to what extent do these overlap, right? So if we presume that the target is the workplace or the site of employment, then we can talk about how, to what extent these assessments simulate the roles, the concepts, and the artifacts of the workplace. For example, the role of a workplace role might be something along the lines of a manager, right? A team leader, in terms of the CEO, etc. Whereas the role as defined outside of a workplace could potentially be anywhere from a lecturer, a student, a janitor even, right? Basically anything that's not part of the target, which is the workplace. Now, in terms of concepts, we can have concepts that are very specific to the workplace and concepts that are not necessarily specific to the workplace. So for example, if you have things like, say, in accounting, you can have, say, the balancing of accounts as a concept would be something that's quite specific to the workplace. You don't really balance your accounts in the classroom, right? But in the classroom, you can have concepts like, accounting ethics. Now that could potentially be part of the workplace, but it might not necessarily be a big focus there. It might be something that pertains a lot more to the textbook that you are reading in class. Then you have artifacts. So are the items pertaining to the workplace or not? Having things like having your laptop, your phone, your software, specific accounting software, so on and so forth, could be part of the workplace. Or you can be talking about software that's completely outside of the workplace, simulations that people run in the classroom. So you get what I mean. We are not here limiting ourselves purely to a document. We are talking about the practice as a whole. What are the things in it? What are the people in it? What are the documents and things that allow that to happen. Now, if we are talking about relationship between constituents in terms of RA, we could interpret that in terms of the purpose to which those constituents are being put. So for example, what are the relationships Are you talking about superior to subordinate kind of a relationship, co-workers as relationship, as opposed to, expert versus non-expert within the classroom? What are the kind of activities that are carried out in, you can have a company get together, which is not something that you find within the classroom. Communication, and that I'm referring to genre types in terms of SFL, what are the kinds of documents, and communication, channels of communication that you see in the workplace or not. So if we apply that to comparing between, say, the authentic assessments that we have with us versus, say, a multiple choice of concepts, right? So just to calibrate where we are at. You can see how to the authentic assessment people, having a multiple choice about, say, what is the definition of planetary health, right, would fall very much towards the exotic, right? Being able to quote something directly from your textbook. Okay, why is that the case? Because on the one hand, in terms of PA, being able to cite a definition of planetary health has nothing to do with what people are actually doing in their employment. Nobody might even mention that definition during the course of their work. And defining concepts is not something that's typically done in the workplace, right? People take actions, they coordinate actions around those concepts rather than to define it generically. So that would pretty much fall within the exotic space. But if you compare between the case study and the campaign plan, what do you see? Are they both within the sovereign? What do you guys think?
Do you have something that kind of summarizes the how you're enacting the concepts? So we're supposed to be looking at the rubric, the campaign plan and pitch on the multicolored tables. Is that right?
In fact, we could look at different parts of this practice.
Which bit are we supposed to be looking at?
So perhaps let's just start with the overview. So if we look at the overview itself, and please feel free to comment and add to this conversation so that I won't be just listening to myself. But if you look at the overview of the two, you find that, say, the case study requires some kind of a pair work that they are supposed to present, right? So if you look at it in terms of PA, there isn't very explicit mentioning of roles. Potentially, they could be talking about actual real problems because it is a case study. But in terms of RA, sorry?
Sarah's got a question, I think.
Yes, Sarah?
Yeah, hi, sorry. I just want to zoom out just a little bit. I may have missed this, but the arts and education unit of what subject? What's the unit fall into? Because that would really inform whether or not this is as authentic or not. Is it marketing?
This
Graduate
is
certificate in planetary health degree.
Yep.
What's that? What can you do for that? What job will you get?
It's a good question. And it might be a limitation of how we've selected our examples for use in this session.
No, it's good. It's just that if we're going to figure out what is the sovereign code, we need to know what the job you get at the end.
Yep, that's a very good point. From what I can gather by looking at these assessments, the students are expecting to be able to make use of this knowledge as policymakers. So presumably someone who is working for a government body.
In public health.
Okay, so Penny's just clarified.
So if you look at the case study 2 example in the overview itself, right? Sorry, I'm probably showing the wrong thing here. Let me see if I can call up the other one. Is this appearing on the screen?
Yeah.
Case study 2. Yeah. So if you look at this, you can have things like in pairs, and you can think about what are the possible, what are the occasions where people are actually working in pairs as policymakers. On the one hand, we can imagine people having private discussions with their colleagues potentially, but this is not something that is being made very explicit. They were not told, for example, that hey, you there in pairs, one of you is going to be the minister and the other one is going to be taking on this specific position. So that leaves it rather loose in the sense that they could potentially pretend to be one, or they could just simply be themselves as students of a subject working in pairs. Right. And they're supposed to do a presentation. Again, the presentation is not, does not have a specific audience in terms of role. They're not told exactly who they are presenting to in this case. And they're supposed to write an individual reflection afterwards. So to some extent, we can imagine that the pair discussion mimics to some extent a private conversation, but then again, it's hard to place it in terms of where exactly does this occur within the employment in the government body. The individual reflection about the presentation is unlikely to be a task that they are required to generate after they have done the presentation to an unknown generic audience. If we compare that, say, to this one, develop and present a campaign plan to promote a planetary health matter. Once again, depending on who they are presenting to, their roles could potentially be more specific. The task itself sounds like something that they could potentially be presenting to stakeholders, right? So as government employees, you could package up a campaign plan and present a campaign plan and promote it to your stakeholders. So in order to understand to what extent, again, this is clear in terms of PA or RA, we probably have to look a little bit further into the other parts of the document.
Gina put a comment in the chat there about whether there's more power to come in through specialization first. Gina, do you want to say anything about that? I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but I thought it was an interesting comment.
I was just thinking what Sarah said. It's a bit hard to figure out within the sovereign code if we don't know the field, right? Because we're talking about assessment within as a practice, but it's located within a field. We're measuring authenticity. Yeah, so like I'm looking at that overview and I'm thinking, I know nothing at all about this particular certificate. How could I possibly make a judgment on whether it is sovereign code or not? So anyway, Sarah articulated that. So just as I think Daniel was also commenting, and just before we broke out, that specialization I think is useful. Just so as a way in, I consider it a power way in when we're looking at assessment in different fields.
You're helping me to realize my own assumptions too when I'm looking at things like this in terms of the personal sovereign code, if you like. I'm instinctively looking at these examples just now while Ken's been talking and thinking about their I don't have the right words for this just yet, but I don't know, like the operational sovereign code or something from a design perspective. So that's sort of, where does the assessment fit in to the landscape of assessment and design, and the way the purpose lines up with the learning outcomes, which lines up with the rubric, which is later on in this document. And it's interesting that I think where Sarah, you went to the context first and foremost. That was not where I went, just instinctively in my head when I was looking at this and thinking about what comprises the sovereign code, which I think the reason that you brought up the target first and foremost, right? Yeah. I'm just sharing my thinking out loud as I'm going through it. But I think that the specialization comment is really helpful because it does, if we were to dip into thinking about epistemic relations and social relations just for a hot second, then we still have to grapple with the different. So in thinking about epistemic relations, for example, we've got the technical content of the discipline, but then we've also got the technical content of the design of the task itself. And so when you're talking about looking at it and sort of thinking, oh, I don't know anything about this particular field, I think what I'm trying to tease out here is it's also interesting to come to this and think, well, okay, but in terms of the putting together of a task, so this task is called a campaign plan and pitch, which is something we might be able to do in other fields as well. I think it's interesting to think about whether there is a secondary, kind of knowledge base here that.
Can I help you? Can I help
Please
you,
do.
Jack?
Please do, because I'm just thinking out loud.
Right. So what I would suggest is the sovereign code. We can be guided by the sovereign code and what that is by looking at the purpose. Now, in a task, any task that does its job, it needs to have a purpose that situates itself as the sovereign code. That's a design thing, but also it would be what should align with the field. That's what I'm just saying. You don't need to know the field to make, but you do need to know what the purpose is.
I could just add a little bit more to that discussion. I'm looking at the task, and it seems to be a test on the explanatory power of the theory, right? Yes, it's application of it's asking for two things. One is that the students apply, right? But then there's also that big task of having to test the explanatory power of the theory in, I think, what they're calling the transformational power. So that's the way that I'm reading that task. And so if it is a NOAA code, well, there's, yeah, you're gonna have to really have to teach that explicitly, I suppose. Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud. So that's the way that I see the task. Is that like what do you call a typical task in the whole field? It seems like
where these examples come from is a repository of exemplar authentic assessment tasks. So we've noticed that at multiple institutions, these kind of repositories of examples exist. Usually within, in our cases, within the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation, which is sort of our academic development unit at UQ. But it seems like these kind of academic development units at different institutions are increasingly making publicly available examples like these as examples of authentic assessment tasks. What this is now, where I'm going with this in my head, is this is really an interesting discussion to have in view of that purpose of these resources, actually. If you know what I mean.
But I also have 3 points to add to that, reflecting on the conversations that you are having here. So first of all, generally speaking, the courses are not really tied to professions one-to-one, right? You might have very specific courses that do that, for example, TAFE courses. But in terms of a graduate certificate, there is usually a range where you are not necessarily meant to be holding a very specific position in office. It is usually presented more as a disciplinary knowledge that can be reapplied across a number of different potential positions. Now, having said that, right, I would also like to add that first, one thing I noticed about this task is that they did specifically mention about how, so for example, let's look at case study 2. Sorry. If you look at learning objective 4, the student is required to adapt this task to presumably their own profession, their own employment area, right? And that the action plan or the policy change would have to pertain to your area. So because this is a graduate degree, the students would already have some kind of a work background. And if you are working, so environmental science could potentially be in a number of different places. You could be dealing with, say, Southeast Queensland water. This is not tied to the document, I'm just giving an example. Or you could be dealing with forestry, right? So depending on whether you're located within forestry or if you're located within water resources, your action plan is going to be slightly different. So I think I'm not saying that it's not right for us to explore, how this is tied to discipline, but at the same time, I think that it is useful, a conversation, to think about whether or not there's a benefit to be able to derive some kind of a set of principles that you can apply in terms of authentic assessment that could be equally applied across a different number of places. And the last point I just want to very quickly bring up here is that when we're analyzing this, in defining the workplace as a target, in line with the spirit of authentic assessment, it does require quite a challenging change of perspective, because ostensibly a lot of these policies or these documents might be trying to get students to learn a particular theory, right? So that might be the case. But if we were to evaluate these exercises against the notion of authenticity and taking them at their word about authenticity, then presumably the target itself will be the workplace rather than the tertiary education purposes. So even if the task is geared towards learning a theory, that learning could be very well exotic from the perspective of authentic assessment.
Do you just want to bring up the chat there, Ken? Because I think there's a couple of good points in there.
Yep. Yes, please, guys, take over wherever you think is good. We are not going to differentiate between the, we're not going to isolate each of the dimensions in the session.
Okay.
So feel free to join in.
Just to really build on what Ken was saying.
Oh,
What a new arrival.
turn around, new arrival. Nathan, have we been hijacked by a baby? Sorry. Focus.
Sorry, I don't mean to hijack. I've just got to go and put this one to bed.
We do LCT early.
I think that this is the first thing that we need to deal with is authenticity needs to be, you need to find out the core part of it. Now, it's okay for a discipline that is non-specific to any or not aligned with any workplace, it's all right for the field to be the focus of the assessment. But I think it also needs to be made clear, and maybe in both of the tasks, I noticed that neither is clear. The purpose and audience, anyway.
I suppose, you know, we could think about this, what's an alternative assessment that that could be proposed. And so we could, instead of having a campaign plan or the case study, there could be an essay, write an essay, evaluate, you know, conditions of social change, and or write an essay discussing contemporary theory and practice of campaign planning. So then, how does that differ from this? And is one, you know, more authentic than the other? Does it move?
I think more one, is it authentic or engaging? Because I really like the task. Because that's another element of the task, isn't it? Is to be engaging and making your and allowing scope for your students. Because from my experience, if the assignment or the assessment task is interesting, you're going to get much more buy-in from the student, and it's actually easier to grade.
Yeah, I agree with that. But irrespective of that, is one assessment, you know, a test or an essay or some sort of scenario like this campaign plan, more or less authentic? Is it a case that what, you know, it is either is or isn't authentic, or are we looking at positioning it somewhere on a Cartesian plane where it's working more or less towards, you know, the exotic?
Well, I think that that's an interesting point you brought up about how engaging has to be distinguished from authentic, and I do agree with that. I also do think that the notion of engaging itself has got to be deconstructed. Of course, that's slightly outside the scope of what we, you know, have been working on. So, for example, if we were to look at Carl's earlier example of FBI's chasing aliens, I would argue that that is extremely engaging. But compared to these, I would not consider that to be very authentic. So, for example, you know, having FBI's chasing aliens would have PA that are completely outside of the workplace, so it will be exotic. Also, having FBI's investigating aliens could take students down unless you're going to be trained to be a detective. It is unlikely that the task that you're dealing with is sort of RA+, so it's going to move into the exotic as well. But at the same time, it's very engaging. Now, if we look at these ones, compared to that, I would say that relatively it will be closer towards the PA+ and an RA+. PA+ perhaps not very high. RA+ varies a little bit between these two tasks. One of them, you know, is, so if you look at, say, if you look a bit further down, you will notice that one of them has got a structure of an action plan, a proposal about how you should, where was that again? So you'll find that the, you know, the kind of proposal document that they are producing could potentially closely mimic one of the proposals that they are actually doing in their capacity, be it SEQ, water, or, you know, forestry. But the other one involves sort of a very generic discussion about the issue to an unspecified audience that we are likely to hear in maybe, say, when people are networking, but not necessarily something that we would see being executed at the workplace itself. So there is a slight difference between the RA between the two as well. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying again that, you know, if it is inauthentic, it is bad, or that if it is, you know, if it is authentic, then it must be engaging. I'm not making any of these presumptions. Rather, we are looking at it as a continuum. So you can have tasks that are with more emphasis on RA, tasks with more emphasis on PA, tasks with less emphasis on RA, tasks with less emphasis on PA. And indeed, we think that there is something to gain out of both, right? So in our discussions, for example, we find that, students shouldn't be thrown in the deep end. So imagine if your task is PA double plus and RA double plus, then basically you're just throwing the student into the task itself, asking the person to work as an intern with no assessment about their theoretical knowledge, no assessment about their concepts. They just have to perform on the spot. And indeed, we don't believe that is the way to encourage learning.
Sarah's just put a comment in the chat, a question, which is, wouldn't the most engaging task be the most authentic? And I think that this is where, like, a fascinating part of this discussion around authenticity and whether, more authentic is better. And I think where we're leaning towards this, well, what manifestation of authenticity, and in this case, as conceptualized through LCT, is potentially a better question than more or less authentic, because there's been a few comments in the chat that have sort of alluded to this idea of, from specialization, whether things are knower code or knowledge code, might be, we may miss things that we're seeking to cover in an authentic assessment context, just for the sake of making something authentic, in inverted commas. I think that your comment, Sarah, is really interesting for two reasons that are coming to mind. One is that it's sort of getting back to that older definition of authenticity, I think, that came out in the late 80s and the early 90s, where it was about things like engaging the student in problem solving, in critical thinking, in complex tasks. I don't think the idea of engagement would have been too alien to that earlier kind of thinking about authentic assessment. That's just sort of a thought about the literature. And the second point I was going to make is escaping me just now. Oh, right. So then if we see engagement as a constituent of authenticity, it's interesting then to think about, to go back to this question of what the target is, what sovereign code is, and whether there are competing ideas about authenticity, even within the single dimension of autonomy, I think is valuable. And that's also part of that discussion we've had, where it's that thing of, sovereign codes often seem to have a kind of opposite exotic that we are gravitating towards, but that's not necessarily the way that autonomy works, right? Like that's actually, exotic is actually an open field.
Yeah, so exotic could range from, chasing after aliens would be exotic, to doing a multiple choice question in class about definitions, that would be exotic as well, right? So anything that's not geared towards preparing the student for the workplace. Of course, that calls into question what exactly, how do we choose our target? Within the authentic assessment literature, of course, that one of the potential goal of having an authentic assessment is it's a way of finding out if the student is able to perform in the capacity that they're expected to perform after graduation. And going back to the earlier point about engagement, I think that engagement is not really a single dimension in itself either. It's a complex of potential things that I can think of. So for example, realism could potentially can contribute to engagement, right? So chasing up Detectives chasing after aliens would be very engaging, for example, for say undergraduates coming fresh out of high school, but it might not be necessarily very engaging for MBA students who are seeking to build on their careers. They'll be wondering, why on earth am I dealing with this, right? And spending my money on this. And if you have something that is close to sovereign for the MBA students, they'll probably appreciate it. You are talking to me about what I need to do at my job. But at the same time, engagement could potentially fall into the other dimensions as well. So for example, imagine having a lecturer come in and talk about theories with no reference whatsoever to what it might look like in reality would be terribly unengaging, I would say. And having some kind of a semantic wave would also in turn contribute to student interest and engagement, because you're inviting them to see a relevance between what they're learning in their textbooks with what they understand in their daily experience at the workplace.
The chat there, Daniel's put a comment into the chat that I want to see what your response is to it, I think.
Sorry, which one is it?
Can I just articulate it a little bit?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I think what I was talking about, this idea of the knowledge or the concepts and the practice, and I was just reading a chapter in the LCT science book, and it was talking about there's an assumption that the knowledge comes before the practice, and that once you know the knowledge, once you know the theories, you should unproblematically be able to contextualize it. And what this chapter really pointed out to me was the fact that, well, actually contexts are extremely complex in very different ways. And so assessment tasks like this are sort of make the assumption that, you're using these theories, you're using these concepts, and you're going to do them in some sort of role play. But as you said, there's no particular context articulated here. There's no particular audience articulated. And there's no way that any assessment task would be able to sort of account for all of those different possible contexts where it may actually be in practice. So that was more my comment of like, what comes first in authentic assessment? Are we saying that the context is coming before the concept? Just a thought.
Yeah. So thanks, Daniel, for your comment there, which really helps us to segue into the idea that we need to have dynamic thinking around this. What comes first? What is the sequence? And how does it matter? So if we look at, say, this task or the case study 2, the reason why I want to put up these tasks here is because it really helps us focus so that instead of just talking about authentic assessment as a whole, we are really able to zoom in on what people are doing with them, right? So if we look at case study 2 here, okay, you can see how there are 2 parts. You have, in pairs, explore a topic and propose a policy change and consequent action plan. So you have the development of the plan. And then from there, write an individual reflection afterwards. My argument is that there is a slight change in RA. While the first half might not be terribly RA plus, right? In the sense that it's hard to specify what tasks are you talking about at the workplace when you're doing that. But to some extent, we can imagine that policy makers, assuming that this is targeted at policymakers in different fields, we can assume that policymakers can have networking sessions, they can have boardroom discussions where that first part might seem to approximate to some extent, people having a discussion with each other. But once you get into the reflection writing, that seems to be driving it more towards an RA minus, because that kind of reporting, I think, is sort of to facilitate grading and feedback on the part of the instructor for the course. So it starts to approximate more towards a tertiary education purpose. So why is this shift? Why do we have this shift? Why do we observe this shift? The first part is sort of mimicking more of an experiential learning kind of a model, whereas the second part requires the students to think about what has happened in that conversation and to somehow recontextualize that experience as a set of arguments, and how those arguments can then, integrate into their textbook concepts, to reinterpret it in terms of what they learn in class. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? If we imagine the second half is missing, right, then it will be sort of left dangling. There will be no consolidation back into what they have learned in class. I will argue that that sort of breaks the pedagogy, and they will be forced to see textbook learning as being completely separate from their, authentic context or authentic task.
Scroll down to James' comment. It's gonna help a little bit. I'm just picking up on your comment regarding the worldly code there. I think it's an interesting point to dip into semantics for a second.
No, I think I changed my mind. I'm with Daniel. I think specialization as a way in is fine.
Let's maybe look, I mean, Daniel mentioned context, and Ken, you were talking about, strengthening semantic gravity and the context being engaging. In the literature review, they talk about motivation, authentic assessment being motivating. But maybe we'll have a look further down the case study and just look at the purpose now, and just maybe discuss this in terms of semantics and specialization, and just to see sort of where we can do. So those first 3 bullet points.
So I'm sorry to be jumping in. Just
carry on, Gina.
I think what Penny is doing, which is looking at the assessment rubric at the same time, might also be helpful, because the rules of the game for success in this particular task, not that it is fundamentally, or will give you a way into measuring authenticity, but it might help you locate the codes, the autonomy codes. That's where the struggle is, right? A lot of us are trying to figure out, well, what is this field about, or what is this task about? You're trying to measure authenticity. So I think you're doing exploratory right now, right? You're trying to explore different fields and how they practice, or what is the question that you're asking? How different fields of practice? Sorry, remind me again. What is it that you're trying to discover? What is the problem again?
We're trying to understand ultimately what authenticity means. And just as a precursor to that, I also want to say that we are not treating authenticity as a homogeneous thing. We are not saying that authenticity, all authentic assessments are the same thing in any way. In fact, I think we are more interested in exploring diversity within the notion of authenticity, and how authenticity is actually being realized quite differently in terms of the different LCT dimensions. You have different combinations of them.
Right. Okay. So I was just going to say that perhaps looking at the assessment rubric might also be very helpful in terms of how that field considers success. Right, the rules of the game for success is in the marking rubrics. They have set it there. So I just read something that was interesting in the second task, in terms of the high marks. I was looking particularly at how individual assessment the individual writing part of it is articulated. So there's 4 points there.
Which section are you looking at, Gina? The assessment
You're talking about
requirement.
the second task, right? You're looking at the second task?
Case study
Yeah.
2. Yeah.
Case study 2, and also where Ken is saying that there is a shift in the assessment to the personal reflection, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the rubric.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the first or second page, Gina, of the rubric.
Oh, 25 points. I'm looking at the quality of reflection.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think the quality of reflection is going to be assessing the second part of that writing task, right? Writing
Yep.
an
Yeah.
individual reflection afterwards, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, because Ken is talking about where there is a shift in the assessment, right? In the task, in the writing task.
Yep.
It's a two-parter, isn't it?
Yes.
Yep.
And so that's why I'm looking at the rubric, and I'm just thinking out loud that that is, you know, perhaps also a way in to see this big thing that you're trying to look at. It might give you a way into seeing it. Sorry, yep. I've lost my thought. Not
Yep. So I think you're right. I am sort of looking at it in in a very similar trajectory to what you're suggesting there. So in terms of realism, we could break it down in terms of, in autonomy, we can break it down in terms of the first half and the second half, and it's doing something slightly different. But it doesn't, you get a sense that it's not giving us a complete picture because, it doesn't explain why, right? Why do we want to bring students into something that simulates a workplace one moment and bring them into something that's closer to classroom learning in another moment? I think to answer that question, you really have to look into semantics and specialization. Is there anything you would like to add to the shift in semantics?
Well, should we look at the quality of reflection and, the high distinction? What do you need? As Gina was saying, what's the basis of achievement here? The reflection needs to be in-depth and succinct evaluation of the learning experience. So perhaps an increase in semantic density here, and to convey all that sort of meaning. And it has to make connections. And so the next bullet point is really, I think, looking at a semantic wave, perhaps, makes connections between the experience and personal planetary health related learning, unit content, and past learning. So there's a lot in there that the learner has to do to get the top mark. It's relating, the experience to the course content. So perhaps a wave has to occur there. The third bullet point, the reflection explains the learning process and implications for future learning. And the reflection includes insightful responses to feedback. So that's sort of reflecting on the learning process itself, perhaps related to the theme of cognitive challenge in the literature review, this idea of, or perhaps evaluative judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps specialization's coming in there.
So that this suggests to me that, while as Jack mentioned earlier, 70% of the literature is really focused on realism, but you can see how realism itself is not the full picture, and that that cognitive learning, that evaluative judgment really plays an important role underlying why people are making use of authentic assessments.
This is, I think, a common assessment style the social sciences. I'm not sure about you, but I know in several of the program assessments that I've seen in our context, that's kind of that shift into the personal reflection is typical, and usually we've had a few discussions about this in our context. Usually it is about the student's ability to assess the explanatory power of the theory to practice, right?
Yep.
So the first part is usually about students' ability to link, to apply theory to practice, right? Do it. And then the reflection part is usually about looking inward. So I distinguish between inward looking and outward looking. So outward looking is when the students take the theory, what they've learned, and apply it, right? And they draw lines between the theory, the concept, and okay, so it works this way, here, 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 here. And then the second part is where they have to look internally, and it's often much more challenging. It's SR coded, right? Usually, right? But it's tricky because the students have to evaluate the explanatory power of the theory in their application. So they have to talk about whether it had a power, it lacked power, and that's really abstracting, and it's hard. It's not an easy part of the task. And for me, that distinguishes between the A and the A minus. That second half where they have the ability to test the explanatory power of the theory in the field. The rubric is very, very general, and I think it has to be teased apart by those who are operationalizing it.
I mean,
Sorry, that's just my thought at the moment.
No, thanks, Gina.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think we're in general agreement with that. It is interesting to note, the second point, bullet point in the quality of reflection seems to unit content we might assume relates to theory. But the third one, the reflection explains the learning process and implications for future learning rather than the future workplace or profession, perhaps. It's interesting that that's maybe more about learning than more broadly than what they'll be doing in the workplace, perhaps.
the other, and this is a little bit of a segue, but Gina, you've prompted me to, you and Penny in the chat have prompted me to go down this line of thinking, I think in your comments. These two will tell you that Rubrics and I have an interesting relationship with each other, and we are now at the point where we're analysing individual points within the rubric, which is I think we began this discussion, zoomed right out, and we are now honing in. And what's interesting here, I'm thinking of Penny's comment in the chat, which I think if anyone is playing along is the second last comment. The segmentation between these two things is kind of something that we've discussed already, and I'm not sure how convinced I am, to be blunt, about the distinction of so many individual points mapped across these different aspects of the task, which is broken up into 25% chunks, as a case for something that is overall quite authentic, because the segmentation seems to challenge the authenticity of the overall task design. Is that something people agree with or disagree with?
For a 1,000-word essay, I think it would be easier for the teacher to say any of these 4 points in your reflection, right? In order for it to have some depth, right? You either go for any of the, you either talk about the relationship between testing the explanatory power of the theory, or you use one of the measures for looking into the future, the second point, right? Or is it the third one? Otherwise, you have this very light, broad stroke, not very meaningful personal reflections, right? Which is what it's supposed to be a quality reflection. So I'm telling Penny, is it perhaps, it's a bit ambitious, isn't it, for 1,000 words? And then you have rubrics like that. So in the course level, I look at what I would do, and I have had to do this with English majors because we do this too. We've had to bring it down to one thing, right? Either make connections between theory and practice and talk about its explanatory power, or you use any of the measures, right? Talk about how there's so many ways, right? I mean, critical reflection is so big and there's so many different ways to measure it. So use any of those as a guideline to do that part of the task. So yeah, I'm with you there. It's very big, isn't it? Does that answer your question, or
Yeah,
did I go
yeah.
off on a tangent there?
We've got the chat up there at the same time that we're doing this. This is all as just a high level thing, is very, very useful for us to be able to talk through things in this way with other people, because we often end up in kind of our own echo chamber of thinking, and it's so we're processing as everyone's going too. I'm just catching up with the chat.
Is it worth looking at the criteria for contextualization of case and quality of action plan in terms of discussing it as we did the reflection before looking at the other task?
I think so.
So we might think, contextualization of the case immediately brings to mind semantic gravity, doesn't it? And a strengthening of that. So if we just look at these bullet points here, succinctly and comprehensively explains and justifies the case study, context of the professional setting and related planetary health problem being addressed. So perhaps a strengthening of semantic, gravity there, we're talking about a particular case, but to succinctly and comprehensively explain perhaps a strengthening of semantic density as well. We've already talked about the word limits in the assignment. Explanations are inclusive of transdisciplinary dimensions.
I would also argue that the SG here is quite selective. If you look at this bit over here, I can do this very well.
The top bullet point or the second bullet point?
The top one.
The top one, yeah.
Extensive legislative or administrative details are optional. So they do specify what are the things that you need to have SG or SD, and what are the things that you shouldn't.
Yeah, and the next bullet point is sort of SG even more. It's a very, the action plan to implement the change, and the who, the how, and the timing of the activities.
Yep.
So very sort of strongly contextualized there, how you get what, how it's going to be proposed. Do we want to compare this with the rubric of the other one?
Well, I just thought I would just pause for a second.
Oh, yeah.
We're at 12:15 now, so we have about 45 minutes left on the clock.
Yeah.
And I just think it's probably a good point just to also, if you want to take the discussion in a different direction at this point.
Are you suggesting a break?
No, not just to flag that we've got about 45 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, initially we were thinking of having the third hour as a consolidation of the 3 rooms, but because we are now already crossing the 3 different dimensions at the same time, we are not really going to have a distinct break between the second and third parts. But yeah, maybe towards the last half an hour or 20 minutes, we will then zoom out and talk about some of our conclusions from here.
That's a good plan.
Yep.
With the assessment and pitch, if we look at the other assessment task rubric, just click on the other PDF. I'm just going down to, here we go. Again, looking at the basis of achievement here. This is for the campaign plan and pitch. Again, having a look at this in terms of semantics and semantic brevity and density, it seemed to be really in the third criteria, transdisciplinary engagement. Demonstrates a strong transdisciplinary perspective by employing social change discourse clearly informed by Indigenous cultural studies and critical whiteness theory. And that seems to sort of be, we often think about this, cognitive the theme of cognitive challenge as linking theory and practice. That seems to come through most in that criteria more than perhaps the other ones. And that's only 10% of the overall one. So in the second task, it's there, but it's obviously not foregrounded in the same way or valued in the same way. And I thought that was just an interesting point to make. In the second one, attention to difference and diversity, the first bullet point, difference and diversity are treated with respect and empathy. And I wonder if that was worth sort of a comment in terms of specialization.
Yeah, that's the in terms of the criteria in the rubric, they are quite strongly SR rather than ER.
So the second one on the left there, attention to difference and diversity.
Yeah, I would agree with that in general.
So in this task, perhaps more than the other one, the foregrounding of.
I mean, it's interesting to see, I think, when. So we started off with this discussion of like, there was realism and cognitive challenge and evaluative judgment. And one of the interesting things for me looking at this is to see where on a rubric, for example, some components seem specialization heavy, other components seem semantics heavy. The reflection seemed semantics heavy to me. I've not actually ever really thought about that before and what the implications for that might be, but perhaps there is a design implication there for the crafting of useful tasks in terms of, doing some analysis of the field you're aiming to teach into, or the course that the students are doing. And I mean, ultimately the question is what you're trying to cover, isn't it? And what's appropriate in that context. But all of that to say that it is interesting to see in a rubric setting the different dimensions represented strongly in a kind of independent way at times.
Yeah, I think some of them are, much more clearly articulated in some areas of the rubric than others. And I think, as Gina talked about earlier, it's only by zooming back and looking at a full program that you sort of start to see this. By comparing tasks or looking across a 2 or a 3 year program, you start to see, an overview, a map, if you like, of what's being foregrounded, what's being emphasized through the assessment.
If you look at this one here, is this point? Sorry. No,
This is the
contextualization.
This is the case study, Ken.
Yeah.
Contextualization of case, yeah.
If you have something like policy, proposed policy change is clearly justified and feasible, The feasible seems to be flagging some kind of an ER dimension to this.
I mean, look, to me, that says it's looking for an argument about a rationale for the capability, and I don't know that I could code that necessarily based on that datum.
Yeah.
An individual point of data. I mean, this is why I don't do
Yeah, so it is problematic, isn't it, in the sense that, well, on the one hand, the rubric does provide clues as what is at stake, but on the other hand, it seems necessary to delve back into some of the details on how that rubric item is meant to be interpreted.
It's a big question, isn't it? Like, why does an item show up on a rubric? It's not. And that's not a very what's the word? Snazzy question to ask, but it's a very important one.
Yeah,
Well, the rubric, yeah. For me, the rubric really shows the fuzziness of what you're trying to explore here, right? You're talking about a very fuzzy concept, authenticity. Well, there you go in the rubric. It states to you just how fuzzy it is.
that's right, Gina.
It's one way into unraveling the fuzzy. That's just the way that that I've come across it, because I've had to look at it for a very fuzzy concept like critical thinking, right? That was my PhD. And so I feel you. I feel you in having to map what it is in practice in the field. So for me the marking rubrics is a window into that fuzziness. And so that's it contains the rules of the game for success, and that's how students are assessed. And so if the teachers don't understand that they have to think a little bit deeper into the rubric, then we stay at the fuzziness. That's the issue, isn't it?
I would like to respond to that with this thought that, yes, you are very right that the rubric is what makes the task equitable and should be therefore as transparent as possible. But on the other hand, I have experience creating rubrics that are 3 pages long. So what happens is there is a practical dimension of how explicit a piece of rubric should be. I know Jack also has further thoughts about whether it can be explicit. But even if you try to make it explicit, there is constraint on it. So what you call a window from a linguistics point of view, I do see rubrics as intertextual, whereby it provides a cue, right? So when you said window, I presume you mean that the rubric itself is not exhaustive, that it provides you with a cue into something else beyond the rubric. And the way I see it is that the rubric behaves sort of like an intertextual thing where it provides a cue, a reminder, if you will, that links to something else. It points you to something else within the material. It could be something that the teacher has mentioned in class. It could be something that's found in the instruction part of this document. It could be, in some other learning guide that we may not have access to. And if the student has access to those other material and know how to link from the rubric to those other material, then there will be some kind of an explication that can be found there, perhaps. I'm just thinking aloud as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking, one of the challenges that we have is having to work in isolation. But if we're looking at practice, I think we really have to talk to those who have to operationalize the rubrics, right? Because a lot of it is explicit to them, but implicit to us, right? We're looking in from a language point of view and the way that we would interpret it. But for those who have to operationalize it, we're talking about practice. So it is the practitioners that hold the understanding, a more in-depth understanding of the rules of the game for success, because they are looking at that rubric, they understand it in a particular way, they know the nuances of it. And so without those interviews with practitioners, well, we are still outside of that field, aren't we?
This was a conversation we had too in planning for this session. What do we actually bring along as an example? Because we didn't want to restrict it to a rubric from one of these examples and focus in on one specific bit. And the best we could kind of come up with, I think, was these task outlines, because they at least give a sense of the context of the task and what it's sort of aiming to do. I think, in an ideal world, we would have a kind of like a portfolio of data that we would bring along for a task like this. And it would, so I just mentioned that to say that it was a limitation we felt when we were trying to think about how we could productively just structure this discussion. And I think we echoed your sentiment there around the need for like a rich study of a context, basically, to really see inside of what that was. So yeah, we certainly are imagining, I think, to some extent here to help ourselves along too.
And not only speaking to practitioners, but actually looking at the work the learners produce, because you can sort of make some informed, guesses about the work, but you really need to see it, to the work the learners produce to really understand what's going on.
Sarah has a comment.
Sarah.
Oh, it's school holidays. Everyone's singing. My question was about this rubric and task alignment, because I think that is where the authenticity can be apparent. And if the task has big wave potential, then a potential for the students to be able to do their thing and wave in their responses or in their oral responses or however it's going to be demonstrated, then that you've got to consider those three things. You've got to consider the task, the students, and also the teachers, the lecturers. For example, the rubric has to be robust enough to enable a casual marker to come in and mark it authentically and effectively. Just going to throw that into the mix.
And that's where we, I think, get into that discussion of design at the sort of zoomed out, oh, excuse me, catching in my throat. I know one of the conversations we've had before is to do with choosing your evils, basically, in terms of simplifying or making things complex and navigating the compromise of a course design situation where you have multiple stakeholders having input into what should be represented in the artifact.
It's the rubric, not the task.
I think an interesting debate to have here is what is the division of labor? So I can imagine if we make an argument that a rubric should be as explicit as possible in order to be equitable, if you push that to the extreme conclusion, then the rubric should really be the textbook, right? And the entire curriculum, and your document is going to go on for hundreds of pages. But you don't want that. And as you move towards the other side of the spectrum, where the rubric starts to get simplified, then more and more is being made implicit. So then the question is, how do we approach, how do we include this implicitness into the assessment? I know that there are some assessors who are fond of designing rubrics or even pre-rubric era. They are fond of designing assessments that are completely opaque, because the ability of the student to link it back to any material is fully on the student, right? The burden of doing that is fully on the student. Whereas what we are advocating for is an assessment that's explicit to the extent that students are led towards seeing that link without having to provide that link themselves necessarily, to take guesswork out of it. And that guesswork not being part of, what is at stake.
But the rubric, if you look at the task, the criterion in the rubric, that should be summarizing the task. And I think it also points to the way rubrics are written, because you can have a very simple description of what good, better, best looks like, or able, more able, and perfectly able, it looks like, without it, but you have to change the language. So those four, the criteria down the side, those should ideally align with the task. And if they don't, they're still the things that the student's progress is being measured upon.
Ostensibly is the key word, I think, there too.
Tell us a bit more, Jack.
Well,
Rich rubrics.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, I do. Well, I think I do, but I still find it, I mean, as these two will tell you, I fundamentally find it hard to be convinced by rubrics in general. I think we've had this conversation too, Sarah, actually. And part of that has to do with how well they can do the job we or whoever is claiming that they can do. I didn't necessarily want to go super into that side of things, because I think that's a separate discussion to what we're talking about here in terms of where we started to go. And also because I will rant if we go in that direction. But
is it though?
Well, I mean, from an authentic assessment perspective, I think the inclusion of a rubric, the decision to use a rubric, and a separate part of this discussion that can be long and intensely debated is what is your alternative to having a rubric. The decision to make use of a rubric in itself is a fascinating thing, because that is, I would argue, rarely an authentic part of a professional practice. Not always, they exist in the wild, if
But
you
it
like.
should be.
Well, that's an interesting accession too. But the, I mean, how does that apply to a professional musician? That's my professional context, remember, too. So we don't really experience the rubric in the wild all that much. I won't say we don't, because checklists exist everywhere sometimes. But my point is, the rubric sets out claims that are a subset of the possible claims that could be made about what comprises quality of work. So decisions need to be made or decisions are made about the scope of those claims and their arrangement, sometimes their weighting and so forth. And we have discussions about that.
I disagree.
Hold on, a high level concern for me, I'm about to stop talking because I don't want to keep listening to myself. A high level concern for me is the degree to which that is the most robust path, as opposed to, well, I'll just come out and say it, as opposed to holistic appraisals and the potential for those to express integrity. I sort of didn't totally want to bring that up because I don't want the conversation to be dominated by that. But go on.
I'll be simple. Right. There's kids yelling in the background. Right. For example, sorry, was it Gina's turn to talk?
Yeah, when you're finished, and then I'll add to this very rich discussion about rubrics and the rules of the game for success, being important that the students have access to the rules of game of success.
And the staff.
So that present a campaign. The rubric should have 3 parts to it, right? Some kind of rubric discussion about the knowledge of planetary health, right? What a good presentation, what does that look like? And how well do you plan, right? They're the things that should be tested. The rubric should align with the authentic assessment. The reason the thing that makes this assessment task less authentic is the fact that the rubric does not reflect the requirements of the task. The task is great, but the rubric doesn't match.
What's
Right,
missing?
so-
What's missing, Sarah?
Can you turn to it on the screen? I'm trying to do phone and computer at the same time whilst kids are in the pool.
This one.
Yeah, so where is the bit that describes planetary health? The knowledge, the knowledge.
The third one, I think, transdisciplinary engagement.
No, that's engagement, it's not knowledge.
And it specifies indigenous critical studies and critical whiteness theory.
Sorry, I was put off by the criteria title. And planning. So
The first one, I think, first bullet point.
I think I see your point though,
and
Sarah.
Yeah.
presentation.
The bottom one.
Yeah, the persuasiveness. Yeah, I don't know. I just think that it could be written a bit better. And I agree with Tann. You can't be specifying to the nth degree, but you do need to be kind of a bit more richer in your description of what that looks like, instead of good, better, best.
Yeah, I can
It should
certainly
go
see
from
that.
it should go from simple to complex. It should wave, right? Our rubric should wave.
Yeah, I'd like to, yeah, I agree with the 2 points that you made there. One of it is whether or not rubrics should be sequential. We can think of it, I'm not sure how many of us here are from an SFL background, but we can think about it in terms of whether the genre of the assessment matches the genre reflected in the rubric. Should the sequence match, right? Should we have first part correlates to this part of the rubric, followed by this is the second part, followed by this is the third part. There is a pedagogical consideration there. Should students work through those sequences, or should it be a snapshot that is, taken across the board, where every single part of the sequence is broken down into multiple dimensions that are simultaneous? And what that does in terms of student preparation, what that does in terms of assessment practices. So that's one part of it. And the other, I think, very useful point that you brought up there is how, so far we had a conversation about how rubrics are useful as windows or intertextuality into into the curriculum, into the assessment as a whole. But that is an assumption on our part, right? That they match. So what happens when they don't match? Then you can end up with some kind of a tokenism or inequity, where an assessment is labeled authentic based on its setup, but has nothing at all to do with the rubric part of it and how it's actually being assessed in the end.
Right.
So that's actually a very important point, I think. That within the holistic design, that one component sticks out. Sorry, Jeannie, you were going to
Yeah, I was going to say, when I'm looking at that rubric, it seems to me that that's more a program. That's a program rubric, right? And then the burden of having to unfold that falls on the teacher. And for those of us who teach genre, that's a no-brainer. We know how to take a text apart, and we say, go through it with the students, and we know that, okay, so this is what students in 2004 did, and this is this part of the rubric. Now, if you decide to do it this way, so I'm just looking at the critical reflection part, the personal reflection part, which seems to have like 2 or 3 different ways to do it, we would make that accessible to the students, right? But that's from yeah, look, as a practice in the classroom, but I'm trying to look at it from the way that you're trying to map this very fuzzy thing coming in through a program rubric. Yeah, I don't think it's possible to do it without access to those who have to operationalize this particular one. Because I think we do that automatically as practitioners. We're given a program rubric, we're given student learning outcomes, and we know that this is the task that is going to be assessed for the program, right? And then we unpack it for the students with samples of what has been done that have been successful in previous years. So there's a lot that goes on in the classroom in terms of making the rubrics accessible to the students. And I think when you're looking at authentic tasks, you probably need to do that. It's hard to just look at the language of it, outside of the field, right? I don't know what your situation is. I'm very sorry. I'm assuming a lot of things. I came in late into the problem that you discussed in the beginning, your particular situation there in Queensland that you're trying to do. Are you engineering curriculum are you engineering something to intervene, or you're just mapping? You're trying to make visible this very fuzzy notion of authenticity.
We are sort of doing an ethnography, if you will, and looking at diversity in authenticity. So we're mapping the terrain, in a sense, an exploratory mapping of the terrain. So, we have seen how authenticity is in some sense relative. We have seen how authenticity is in some sense dynamic. So for example, within that one task, we can see that authenticity itself can shift, right? And that shift can be meaningful, it can be deliberate, or it can be left random depending on who designs it. And we have had some discussions about this previously, about how, a big dichotomy thinking of authenticity is not itself helpful, because there is a reason why classroom instruction is there in the first place. Because if you throw that out and you just simply throw that, the student completely into the workplace with no foundation whatsoever, then it's basically just a sink or swim, right? Going back to the point that you were just making there about how you unpack rubric and assessment for the students. If you imagine, and I'm just using a made-up example here, but you can imagine if you were to create a program that is purely an internship. You take the student, you throw the student into the workplace. At the end of the internship, the supervisor writes up a report, sends it to the coordinator, and then the coordinator will mark, their work. Potentially, you can have a rubric that is sent to the supervisor who has no experience in that rubric, who was not responsible for designing that rubric. I don't know to what extent the coordinator would have had a chat with the workplace supervisor about the rubric. And potentially you can have the supervisors just simply writing in a report, and then the coordinator has a rubric against which the coordinator submits the final grade to the university. In each of these scenarios, whose task would it be to unpack the rubric, if you will, for the student? Who will that responsibility rest on?
good question. That's a good question, Ken. We're talking about trade, right? Where the rules of the game for success is usually with the assessor, but even then, that assessor, I would say with the assessor, at some point are going to have to put it down because it has moved into the classroom. If it is out in the field, well, the students kind of pick up, right, that the trainer values certain kinds of things, and they pick up the rules of the game for success. But our situation is that a lot of these trades, are inward facing now. We're in the classroom, and so the onus is on the one that instructs to make the rules of the game of success visible. So perhaps a collaboration between the two,
Yep.
the one who is instructing and the one who is assessing. We also
And
have
the
double
very
blind marking. We also have double blind marking in the university, right? Whereby someone who didn't teach the course is assessing. And that, I know the British system works that way. I think Australia works that way too. So you will have these disagreements between the double blind markers, because especially those who do program, right? Those who do program assessors will mark in a particular way. This is the way that they expect the student learning outcome to come through in a document. And then there is the lecturer who lectured in a particular way, and they emphasize this particular thing that they taught. So it's there within the university, the issues around the marking rubric, which I think that we kind of have to handle when we're looking at assessment, right? Whether it's
and,
authenticity, or I looked at something very vague like critical thinking, very, very vague. And those are the issues at play.
yep, you have pointed out the importance of the role of the instructor. And if you think about it, once you have an instructor as a role, what happens to the PA, right? And if you have instruction as part of the process, as part of the practice, what happens to the RA? So effectively, we are sort of transitioning between the sovereign and something that is more towards the other codes at the same time, if you look at it in terms of autonomy, right? And that if we have, an assessment practice that's built completely in the sovereign, would actually backfire, because then there is no translation involved. There's no foundation work involved, right? And once we can, so on the one hand, we see a value of that kind of transition where we need some kind of an autonomy tour. To understand what is behind that, really, we got to look into things like the semantic waves, right? So how do you pack and unpack as part of this shift? Whether something is, how to link between theory and practice? How do you, shift in terms of lower semantic gravity to higher semantic gravity and back and so on?
Yeah. Anything to add on specialization and authentic assessment?
I mean, yeah, I'm glad that we did get to a point of discussion about the place of the rubric, because that's the problem that is of most interest to me within this discussion, or has historically been of most interest to me in this discussion, because it is still something that makes me uncomfortable. The rubric is a thing I'm interested in looking at further, because to what extent is the rubric a pedagogic resource? To what extent is it a resource for it to support the assessor, independent of actually providing students with access to the resources they require, to skills and capabilities they require to execute the work. And if that's the case, should the student not be able to formulate the rubric themselves? So that's why I'm uncomfortable about the rubric. And why I'm interested in its place within the design of an assessment.
That is so good.
It's
because I think that all assessments should be created with the students, because then the rules of the game are visible.
Yeah, but that's the whole tension we face, isn't it? The visible, invisible pedagogy that we face in education, right? So we can, you know, we're all SFL, LCT people, so we're all about visible pedagogy, and it should be a pedagogic tool, and it needs to be unpacked, and we need to work, you know, we need to go through deconstruction and construction with the students. But are we a minority in education?
Well, we shouldn't be.
I know we shouldn't be, but the reality of the situation.
But that whole process is the language of learning, isn't it? Creating a rubric, and if you've ever done it with a class before, it's the best thing ever, and you want to do it again, because there are no stones unturned. There is nothing that nobody doesn't know about unless they're not there. But you get the best out of everyone. Everyone's invested. And that, I guess, is the secret of authentic assessments, where I started this conversation, is you're trying to figure out what authentic is, and you were talking about the task, but it's actually the buy-in from the students, the engagement as well.
That's my question for you. Is the authentic element, or authentic in authentic assessment, does it mean that you're actually assessing what you're saying you're going to assess? Okay, or is authentic assessment relating to what you're learning in the institution will actually be relevant to the real world context in which you'll use it? They're two different meanings of authentic assessment, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you have both?
I think you've got two targets.
You've got two targets. That's exactly the way that I'm thinking about it, for sure. I mean, the thing about assessing what you say you're going to assess is the you know, my personal interest in this, and that is part of my gripe with rubrics, is that it's sort of like the situation you don't want to have is where, you know, it's like you present I don't know, like an invisible cookbook to somebody or something like that, and you say, here's the ingredient list, make it work. You know, that's the undesirable situation. And the reason that I brought up that point about the student should be able to formulate the rubric, what I really mean by that is students shouldn't be surprised by what they're being assessed, the feedback that they're getting and the grades they're getting at the end, ideally. But the problem on the rubric design side is that if we're dealing with complex tasks, authentic tasks, you often see complexity is a hallmark of that. There are infinite ways one of those tasks can look. They might fit within a similar genre, but there are still, like, if we're being really fine-grained about it, there are infinite ways a response can look. And so the appropriate criteria that are relevant to each individual response are similarly variable. And so to be able to provide students with access to a situation where they aren't surprised, where they would be capable of, and this gets back to that evaluative capability thing we were talking about earlier, where they're in a place of being able to actually appraise quality. I think that's one of our main challenges. That's, you know.
I think my reservation on giving students, you know, of collaborating on rubric writing is that it assumes that the students have the right level of ER in the discipline in order to co-write the rubrics, right? Because I mean, in a classroom situation, we think that the teacher is the practitioner, seasoned, knows a lot, and will be able to recognize the different variations of this one thing that we mean, right? When we are talking about this one small thing, we know that it can happen this way, this way, this way, that way. Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
I'm not
It-
much
it's
co-writing that rubric with the students yet, because the rules of the game for success needs to be very clear to the instructor and to the assessor. And we write, I mean, from a
yes,
curriculum writing point of view, right? We will know, what do we assess? What do we value? We write the rubric for it and the task. That's the first thing we write, right? It's the cart before the horse, so to speak,
No,
right? That's just
should we though?
well,
Because I don't do that.
well, some of us are trained to do it that way. What do you value?
So I tell you, I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example is that the part of the rubric that should be co-designed with students is, and I guess that's a misleading word. So the 4 criteria that are obvious in the first example of the rubric, the first rubric example, those 4 criteria are the heart and soul of what students are going to be doing, learning, being part of. And if you give an overview on the first week of what's going to happen and this is what we're learning, if you gave, like, say, an example of an authentic task, then students, you could pull out what's important about that and you create those 4 criteria, and that is their guide for the rest of the course. Now, I'm not suggesting the students actually create the course criteria. I'm just suggesting, controversial, I'm suggesting that we already know what they are as teachers and we're leading them to that. So we're giving them an authentic task at the beginning of the course, and the students understand what it is. For example, in my unit, it's a first year undergraduate teaching, we have to do a lesson plan. So what we do is the first day of the first week, we see a great lesson and you instinctively pull out what was that great about it. And they come up with some ideas, and then we have loose areas, and they're usually always content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and engagement. They're the 3 things that are really obvious even for the layperson. And guess what? That is what the rubric is going to test you on at the end of the course.
Can I suggest, Sarah, that what you said reminds me of when Theo van Leeuwen talked about the oracular text, where instead of focusing on the rubric as a product in itself that stands alone apart from practice, really we need to think about the rubric as part of that practice, and to focus on the practice in which the rubric merely facilitates what goes on in that practice, right? So this is sort of a different conversation from who controls that practice in the sense of classification and framing, right? Whether it falls on the part of the instructor or it falls on the part of the student. Sorry guys, but we are running short of time, just so that we don't overlap into the next session. This was a very wonderful session and a very engaging conversation, all the way from authenticity into the specifics of rubrics and its role within authentic assessment. We'll just stop here with a nice little quote from Carl himself about the idea of inauthenticity. We'll be very happy to continue this conversation. We'd just like to be polite to the next people who are going to present. So thanks everyone, and I look forward to having
thank you so much.
engaging with more conversations around this. Thanks.
You see him now, please, Daniel? Hello, big boy.
Nathaniel, hey, say hello.
The baby.
Patty's friends.